Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to our next show on organizing in the time of COVID-19. Today, we're going to be talking about a really interesting book produced by Lou Turner and Helen Neville, recently published on Fanonian psychotherapy, Frantz Fanon's psychotherapeutic approaches to clinical work, practicing internationally with marginalized communities. It's the first collection of its kind to situate, actually push Fanon into disciplines, professions, and practices of psychology. The case studies are powerful, recognizing Frantz Fanon's remarkable legacy to applied mental health in therapeutic practices with which decolonize, humanize, and empower populations. This text serves as a timely call for research, education, clinical work to establish the further developed Fanonian approaches and practices. Today, I have with me Lou Turner, who is a clinical assistant professor. Some of you may remember my speaking to him a short while ago. He's from the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Illinois. Helen Neville is professor of educational psychology and African American studies. And to help moderate the discussion intelligently, we have Nigel Gibson, who, again, somebody we have spoken to before. Nigel is the author of Fanon, The Post-Colonial Imagination, 2003, Fanonian Practices in South Africa, and also with Roberto Benduccio of Frantz Fanon, Psychiatry and Politics. A warm welcome to you all to our show. Thank you for joining us. Nigel, would you like to take the lead in discussing the issues raised in this really important book?
Thank you, Feroz. Thank you for inviting me, and also thank you, Helen and Lou, for being here for this discussion, which, as you can see from the ticker below, is called Fanonian Revolutionary Practice and Fanonian Psychotherapeutic Practice, which is interesting in the sense of thinking about Fanon and the practice of Fanonian concepts. What I want to begin with is really ask Helen and Lou about the process of working on this book, which, as we were discussing a little bit earlier in terms of the politics of love, there's a certain element what comes across in the book as a work of love. In other words, this is not about publishing an academic work. This is really an important collection of thinking and practicing Fanon's psychotherapeutic approaches. So, in that particular sense, I'm thinking of the labor that both of you put into it. How did you conceptualize it? How is it put together? How did you work together? I mean, lots of different questions come just in terms of making the book.
Well, I can kind of kick it off. Helen and I are at the University of Illinois, and we were colleagues in the Department of African American Studies. And at the time, the head of the department was a colleague and comrade of ours, Sundiata Chajua. And Helen and I developed, co-imagined a course on Black liberation psychology. God, I'm trying to remember when it was, 2012 or something. And so obviously Fanon played a seminal role in that course. And then Helen asked me to participate or contribute to a research project of hers, which I think we mentioned in the introduction to our book, was a research project on recognition and respect in the development of Black identity, and it is national, transcontinental, with her own research, empirical research across several continents, and discussing and meeting with Black people and how their identity and how recognition and respect played a role in that. And I contributed my small piece of that work, mostly in bringing in a Fanonian framework into it. And then actually it was Nigel whose attempt to publish Fanon's clinical papers was kind of a next moment for me. That is, reading clinical papers by Fanon that had been published in very obscure journals, but not easily available to a broader public. Finally, another version of those papers was translated and came out first in French in 2000. I guess it was 15, and then another one into the English translation in 2018. And it's around that time that it struck me the significance of what Helen had done in her research. And that is that it was one of the few times that I can recall, and I'm pretty conversant with Fanonian literature, the Fanonian literature, it's one of the first times I can recall of a researcher actually empirically testing Fanon's concepts. And it just hit me, and it came out at the time when Nigel was translating and attempting to publish Fanon's clinical papers, which were very empirical, where you see Fanon actually testing his own concepts and working out his own concepts in the colonial milieu and in a milieu of decolonization. And I said, well, let's try to collect some of these researches that are going on around the world. I mean, I knew about Fanon centers in Los Angeles. I had some relationship to them back in the 1980s. There was the Fanon Center, Research Center in Los Angeles in South Central LA. I came across Roberto Beneducci's Fanon Center in Turin, Italy. There was the Fanon Center in Brixton in England. There are several other Fanon centers I was aware of and whatnot. And so there actually were centers, psych centers, community psych centers around the world that were doing work, that have been doing work on using the Fanonian framework. There are other things I can point to in which community psychology using Fanonian frameworks that I've been involved in, and Helen as well, here in Champaign-Urbana. And I said, let's collect some of these, some of this work, some of these researches, some of the type of therapeutic that people were practicing in the field. And of course, probably with the exception, although he mostly talks about what Fanon had done, with the exception of Hussein Bulhan's book, there have been very few books on Fanon's actual psychotherapeutic approaches, his actual practices. And this was actually looking at how folks were actually doing. Came across work by psychiatric nurses who were using Fanon, studies and research. And so we decided to collect these. And what I say in the piece that I wrote for the book, that it led me to an empirical turn. Unfortunately, a poor use of words. I'm not an empiricist in that sense, but that it was an empirical turn in my work on Fanon. For the most part, most of the Fanonian industry, it's not even a cottage industry, it's a global industry, is mostly discursive. And it's what I had been involved in a lot of the times. There's very few things on Fanonian practices. I was privileged to be a co-author of a book, Frantz Fanon, Soweto, an American Black Thought, that looked at Fanon in terms of political practice on the ground within the context of the Black consciousness movement as it was happening. but actually psychological researches, that kind of work, there was very little to be found, and still is very little to be found. And so that's why we decided to do that and reached out globally to people in different parts of the world to contribute. We got a lot of very favorable responses, and a few unfortunate cases, such as Professor Makawi on the West Bank in Palestine he wanted to do it, was unable to do it at the last minute. Several other people in South Africa, Hussein Bulhan wasn't able to come through on it, but we had his work, particularly in his establishment of the Frantz Fanon University in Somaliland, was very inspirational to what we were doing. And we found sociotherapy in Rwanda. There's a lot that's out there, and our book is not just trying to collect these practices, but it's something of a manifesto for others to do this, for more books, more collections, more papers to be written from this point of view of Fanonian psychotherapeutic practices. Sorry for the long explanation.
No. Nigel, you need to unmute.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. I didn't want to get some background noise. Helen, how about you? Can you talk a little bit about your experiences and how you came, your work on the book?
Sure. I was just so enraptured in listening to Lou talk. I'd like to take a step back. I remember I think it was 1987. I was a grad student, and I went to go see Bego, I believe. And after we watched Bego, they had these activists selling books. And what do I come across but Lou's book on Frantz Fanon, Bego and Soweto, and that actually transformed how I was thinking about activism, my own thoughts about humanism. It introduced me at a deeper level to Fanon, and that book has always stood out to me as a critical book in my own awakening and development. And so lo and behold, flash forward over 2 decades after that point, I'm at the University of Illinois, and I get the real treat of having Lou as a colleague. And so we jumped at the chance to be able to teach together this Black liberation psychology course, which was my understanding and awareness of Fanon and who he was. And as Lou said, we collaborated on this empirical research project, which I hope to share more about as this discussion unfolds. And the project was really on this idea of recognition and the notion of how existential recognition among Black folks, and connecting it to this long tradition of racial identity theory within psychology. And so hopefully we can unpack that in a little bit. My other impetus, in addition to everything that Lou has talked about, was that in psychology, they have a tradition of liberation psychology. And it seems as though that Fanon's contributions to this larger liberation psychology has all but been erased. They haven't emphasized his work and teaching, although his writing has influenced many of the people that folks cite, Martin Ferrero, Paulo Freire, and others. So it was nice to be able to center the work of Frantz Fanon and introduce it to some people that might not be familiar with his work. And the other thing is to highlight the continuing significance and insights of his work in a variety of clinical practice. And I'm a counseling psychologist by training. So in particular, I was interested in how do psychologists currently use his insights, particularly those psychologists who were committed to social justice. So that's a little bit about my interest and kind of approach. One of the things that we didn't talk about was the outline of the book. So while we have certain case studies, et cetera, we wanted to make sure that we contextualize the book through history. So the first two sections do a good job of contextualizing Fanon and his work. The first section deals with the clinical work and historical context. And we've got several chapters that deal with this, like Camille Robesville has this really good and interesting chapter on institutional psychotherapy and decolonization of psychiatry. Lou goes into kind of marking out his entire career and really pushing kind of this idea about psychiatry must be political, which I think is important because we can think then psychology must be political, social work must be political, really underlying that. And then also then rounding out that section with a really good discussion and interview we did with Louis King, who was the founding director of the Fanon Research and Development Center in Los Angeles. That moves into a whole other section on history, theory, and Fanonian practice. Our third section deals with Fanon and clinical action, and we have a broad range of clinical action. We have folks working with torture survivors at Bellevue. We have a psychiatric nurse working with Aboriginal First Nations people in Australia. We have somebody in the United States doing interracial kind of trauma work with a rape survivor. And so we think that, and then we also talk about a community activist doing clinical work on the radio and bringing out mental health there. And we end with something that's really understudied, which is Fanon and research action and how insights from the work that he's done influence conceptual, empirical research, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. So it was really fun to think through what would be important and what would push the field forward.
Right. Thank you. I'm getting, because this ticker is going past me all the time, Fanonian revolutionary practice and Fanonian psychotherapeutic practice, I'm wondering whether you can talk about the relationship between those two practices. What is the relationship between revolutionary practice and psychotherapeutic practice in Fanon and in those who try to use Fanon in psychotherapeutic ways?
Well, that's a good question, Nigel. And I guess one of the major takeaways for me in reading your translation, actually, of Fanon's clinical papers was a really profound awakening. I call it a shock of recognition, in that, like everyone else, from the Black Panthers on, from that matter, in his influence within the Black Power movement in the United States, it was always thought that, yes, Fanon was a psychiatrist and that his psychiatry and his psychiatric practices influenced in some way his politics, but that more importantly, his politics influenced his psychiatry. And while that's true, there's that dialectic between his revolutionary politics and his psychiatry. It's upon reading the clinical papers that I realized that really his revolutionary practice was his psychiatry. And like I said, though there was always, in just about every analysis of Fanon, some recognition of the relationship between the two, it's only upon reading and having available, finally, his psychiatric, his clinical papers, that I realized that really his politics, his revolutionary politics, was an extension of his psychiatry, all the way back to some questions he was raising in his dissertation, depending on which one you think is his dissertation. I mean, there was Black Skin, White Man, the first book that we have from Fanon, published in 1952, there's discussion of whether that was his dissertation or not. And then there's finally his dissertation that was accepted at the University of Lyon School of Medicine as his dissertation. And some of the questions he's raising in that about, well, I think Roberto Beneducci's contribution in our book goes unearths a number of very important insights that, going as far back as his dissertation, you see him raising questions about the role of psychology in society and in the kinds of contradictions that he would come to write about in Black Skins, White Masks around the racialization of social relations in society, and how what the psychological content of those racialized social relations are. And so I came out of at least my encounter with this clinical paper with a very different and very new appreciation of the relationship of his psychiatric theory and practice to his revolutionary politics and practice. And so that's one of the things that I got and has changed the way I think about Fanon. It's kind of cool. I mean, it kind of it brings out I refer to a new Frantz Fanon. I mean, for a new generation of young people who are engaging his work. You guys show that mural that was painted recently of Fanon that in response to the George Floyd lynching. It was originally a meme that made the rounds and went viral at the time of the Eric Garner lynching several years before, where Eric Garner is saying, "I can't breathe." And Fanon has this very powerful statement in Black Skin, White Mask that we revolt not for a particular culture, but simply because we cannot breathe. And while it's taken out of context, because the actual statement is in Black Skin, White Mask, and it's in a passage in which Fanon is extending his solidarity to the Vietnamese against French colonialism. And so he's actually talking about the Vietnamese. And it's a very powerful kind of transnational solidarity in the process of recognizing the significance of decolonization. So, but now it just has a life of its own in the moment of the Black Lives Matter uprising. And so there's this whole new phenomenon that's come to the fore for a whole new generation. And just my last point on this is that it comes back to another famous statement by Fanon in chapter 4 of Record of the Earth on culture, which is, he opens everybody, says it, each generation must out of relative obscurity discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And we just have this whole new generation who's discovering its mission to make a revolution against white supremacy and racism. And Fanon is right there right there on the battlefield, in the struggle, as young people attempt to, and some of us older ones attempt to work out new concepts for this movement.
Helen, do you want to engage in that question?
I do. As a psychologist, I'd like to bring this down a little bit to like what this might actually look like in clinical work, and highlight, building on some of the things that Lou has talked about, but also highlighting and connecting it to some of the things that our authors are talking about. So as Lou mentioned, one of the largest or most significant insights really has to deal with the notion of social relationships, and the idea that our relationships with our clients, whether they're individual clients or we're working in larger groups, whether it's group therapy or working in communities, that those are going to relate to the broader social relationships, this broader microcosm. And I think he talks about this and unpacks this in Black Skin, White Mask. So the notion is that we've got these racist hierarchies, and that these notions of racist hierarchies will also play a role in the clinical or therapeutic relationships, particularly if we're talking about interracial relationships. But they might also play out if they're intra-racial relationships as well. And each of the clinical papers talk and unpack what that actually looks like, how it materializes as in the therapy session or in the group work that people do. The other thing that I think was really interesting, Luke Lord, he talks about this notion of cultural safety and connects it to the work of Frantz Fanon. And essentially, Frantz Fanon is the first that's really unpacking is, how is it that we create an environment that can almost counter some of the racist, the racism that exists in society, and that you first have to acknowledge the way that racism actually shows up in the clinical work. And so they talk about, you create a notion of cultural safety. You as a clinician have to demonstrate in that actual therapy relationship or that therapeutic setting that you value the person in front of you, that they are the experts of their lives, that you are not judging them. And so how is it that you create, what are the ways in which you create this cultural safety? And I think Fanon's writing helps provide insights to that many, many years later, or decades later, folks who focus on multiculturalism and multicultural psychology and cultural competency are really drawing on insights about that. Another has to deal with this whole notion about racial trauma, and that he talks about in Wretched of the Earth, but also in Black Skin, White Mask, the notion that racism or racial oppression or colonialism, that is traumatic in and of itself, and it is violent. There's lots of various different forms of violence that can come from that, the physical violence, but there's also the emotional and mental violence that can come from that. And so this idea about racial trauma is real. I know a lot of folks that are working on that. Janet Helms has really brought that and popularized that in contemporary times. But that notion of racial trauma is real, is rooted in Fanon kind of work. And if we were thinking about some of the things that are happening right now in cutting edge research in psychology, it has to deal with racial trauma and healing from the racial trauma. And Fanon is the one who kind of introduces that and provides some important framework for how to do that. And so there, and one of the articles in there, I believe it's Hawthorne, talks about working with actual torture victims in Africa. But these are people who are now seeking therapy at Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital. And really thinking about how you use this trauma is real, and how then you empower people to kind of move and thrive beyond that, not just to cope with the trauma, but actually to thrive and move beyond that. And they do a wonderful, Hawthorne and his colleagues do a wonderful job of unpacking what that would look like. Some of the ways in which they deal with that, because we know that trauma and racial oppression and other forms of oppression begin to challenge and get at the core of who we are. So we begin to think about, well, like, who am I? What is my purpose? It gets distorted by the trauma. And so they show you how you can begin to deal with that distortion. The other thing that oppression that Fanon talked about is oppression is the notion of having hope is subversive, right? And so the notion of the way in which oppression and racist societies work is to obliterate that sense of hope. And so the notion of working with people is to instill a sense of hope, that they have agency in their own lives, that they can influence not only their own actions, but actions they can make the society and social world better through some of their actions, and thus instilling hope. So he's done I think those are critically important. And the other area of work that is important that deals with the idea about mental liberation, right? So we know we've been socialized, as he talks about in Black Skin, White Mask, if we've been socialized in this society that gives us these negative messages about Black people and these incredibly positive messages about white folks, that we internalize that no matter what our social location is. And so what role does therapy play in unpacking and liberating, breaking those chains from us to embrace this notion of Black pride and respect and dismantling white supremacy that we've internalized. He doesn't say white supremacy, but essentially that's what he means. And so those are some of the clinical insights that I think are particularly important.
Right, and just following up from that, you know, the work is, as you say, practicing internationally with marginalized communities. That's the subtitle of the work. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you'd like to speak a little bit about what, you know, because you contacted many people, but on receiving the papers, what really stood out because they come from specific situations and specific cultural situations and so forth, historic situations. What really stood out to you as something that you were just surprised to see a certain kind of connectivity with Fanon that you hadn't seen before?
You know, I think two things stuck out to me. One was how many of the papers were about immigrant communities, and immigrant communities now frame, you know, obviously in the since Trump's election and even before, for that matter, the question of immigration is front and center and has been front and center in much of the politics, and then immigration across the globe, from people coming across the Mediterranean from North Africa or from the Middle East into Europe. Immigration is huge, and yet we had 3 papers on immigrant communities in Toronto, Canada, with the Somali community. A colleague of ours, Chianiso, and her colleagues up there were working with the Somali community. Hawthorne Smith at NYU Bellevue torture programs, working with immigrant communities, and forget the other one that we had that had immigrant communities. Say that again?
In Italy.
Yeah, Roberto's, and it was actually Roberto's that helped to contextualize all of these in a more Fanonian framework, in that immigration and the immigration crisis was now framed as colonialism, in a colonial frame, in a neo-colonial frame. I mean, torture in Africa wasn't from European torturers, it was from the people that Fanon said to watch out for in the rest of the earth. That is the new national bourgeoisie, who are now heads of these countries, these nations, and were who were now the overseers of a neo-colonial country. And so Fanon's work got sort of repurposed within this new frame of immigration. The second thing I would point out is some of the work that Erica Berman was doing, looking at Fanon as teacher, Fanonianism as pedagogy, and Maria Valgoy, that is looking at the interracial relationship between people of different races. Look at kind of trying to work, coming back to our initial thing that Feroz had talked about love, trying to bridge the gap between Black and white in these cases. And Erica Berman's work looks at that, going back to Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, and Maria Valgoy's work as a young white counseling psychologist working with Black clients in a rape crisis center. And so Fanon's work gets viewed in those terms as well. And I think that has a lot to teach this moment of Black Lives Matter. When you look at the nature of the uprising, is so interracial. I mean, it's, and in many cases, it's more white than it is Black. And so working out what those new relations are going to be for this new generation of activists who are coming on the scene in support of and in defense of Black Lives Matter, I think Fanon's work, as seen through the prism of these kinds of contributions, will be very helpful as well.
Yeah, I think Lou, you did a good job of kind of a comprehensive job of answering that. Maybe the only thing that I could add to that, I was actually struck by the amount of similarities. There were some cultural particularities of things, but some of the underlying processes were similar, in which the application in the cultural context became the difference. So to me, the notion of some of his teachings have this universality if you're dealing with some forms of oppression, which I think that speaks pretty profoundly. But in kind of re-looking at things and thinking about our conversation today, I took another look at Chawaniso and her colleagues' exploration. What they did was it was what we would call a participatory action research project. And they used Fanonian principles for this participatory action research project in a Somali immigrant community in which they really want to begin to think about the violence in the community and notions of safety. And as Lou said, the ideas of violence isn't not, and this applies to any, African-American population in the US, it comes from profound economic, racial kind of use in the context, but it also comes from the context in which folks are coming, the violent context in which people were coming from Somali, which has to do with kind of European integrations within the country. So a nice job of kind of contextualizing that. Well, within this discussion, they talk about, how you build relationships between researchers and communities so that the project is community-led. And when people were talking about the notion of violence, particularly gun violence and other forms of violence in the community, they wanted to center and be sensitive to the issues about the roles of mothers in that and how they can humanize mothers' experiences. And to me, that was really profound. And in that discussion, they pull out a quote from Fanon, and this is from his newer book, Alienation to Freedom. And he talks about the role of mothers. And I'll just read the quote, and then I'll make the connection that I'd like to make. But I think once I read the quote, people are gonna make the connection. A mother is someone who has protected us from suffering, from troubles. It was one's mother that resolved all the little matters. Whenever things are not going well, a desire rises to confide in one's mother. There thus seems to be a habit, a constant in our way of reacting to suffering, to call out for one's mother, because our mother consoles, she caresses our wounds. And what does that remind you of? It reminds me of George Floyd,
right.
Last minute. His mother is gone, but who is he calling out for? To me, that is so profound, and it speaks to a role. I mean, like that Fanon was tapped into it, and he understood that, and that was that stuck out to me. So I wanted to share that.
We would be remiss if we didn't also point out one of the very important points of departure for this text, and that is to get Fanon's work within the psychological disciplines in academia and in professional disciplines where it is so absent. And this is the moment when all of these disciplines, the academy, everybody's talking about, they need something else other than what they've had so far, because clearly structural racism isn't part of the frame of their discipline, either in the social sciences or in the humanities, certainly not sufficiently. And so now they're doing this mea culpa all over the place about their discipline. and but they don't have anywhere to go to find things to actually re-engineer or repurpose and reset the assumptions underlying those disciplines. Sociology, psychology, political science, the history, psychology. And so here, this was also an attempt to shift the paradigm within the social sciences and the humanities with the work of Fanon. And it couldn't have arrived at a better moment than that.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, just one quick thing, if that's okay. Working on this book, Lou was so excited. He uncovered all of these incredible nuggets. And one of the things that he uncovered was this article that was in the Lancet
Richard Horton.
By Richard Horton. And in the editorial that Lou uncovered, Richard Horton was talking about, this whole idea about global health really has its connections to Fanon. And the notion of global health is about power and poverty, violence, exploitation, oppression and silence, collusion and exclusion. All of that he connects back to Fanon, and I think that's really important. And I'd like to make the leap. There have been some states, some folks have been thinking about racism as a public health issue, and I think that Fanon would have a lot to say about that to help us move this discourse from just a small way of thinking about racism and the impact that has on your psychological health. We know it's related to a whole range of depression, anxiety. It has a whole host of things. But to really root that analysis in these structural relationships that deal with that racism shapes. And I think so this notion of racism as a public health concern, we can come to Fanon and see insights that he has to offer on that as well. So.
If I may just say,
go ahead.
I might say, there are silences in all these, both the health and social science disciplines, and one of those silences is racial capitalism, and that we talk not just about structures of racism, but a whole system which has a history and cannot be considered independent of the whole meaning of what racism is. And I just wonder to what extent understanding Fanon gets beyond just the idea of racism and structural racism, but to name the beast. That is the nature of capital itself. And because I think often the debate gets lost there. And my impression in talking to people from North America is a tendency to see racism as an attitude rather than something which is fundamental to the way that capitalism operates. Comments from you too.
I just in recognition of Nigel, who is one of the most prolific writers on Fanon in the world. It's a discussion he and I have been having recently on the issue of racial capitalism. So I'm going to actually ask him to respond to what he's thinking about that. I have a whole thing on it, but I really,
No, well, I'd like to hear from all three of you.
Interviewer, but I think he has something to say as well.
Well, I don't have a whole thing on it. I'm trying to understand the concept racial capitalism. I agree with you, Feroz, that that racism isn't an additive to capitalism. It's part of the very structure of capitalism. And I was just trying to understand the way in which we're using the term racial capitalism, which in its sort of contemporary moment kind of started in South Africa. It was South African activists that in the 70s that were using the term racial capitalism to talk specifically about apartheid South Africa, and then later than that, perhaps in the next period. Then Cedric Robinson developed the concept. So I was really thinking about it kind of conceptually, but actually, it does get me to the next question, and that is, I don't think we can finish the interview without really talking about the work of Dr. King and the Frantz Fanon Center in LA. I mean, I really didn't know before reading the interview with Dr. King about how extensive this center was and how long and how much research that was going on there. So I really like to know from Helen and Lou about this interview and about your discussions with Dr. King, and and really perhaps explain a little bit about what the Frantz Fanon Center was, because I think many people won't even have heard of it. If you want, connect that to racial capitalism.
The Fanon Center in Los Angeles actually had Martin Luther King Hospital, and it was part of the Charles Drew Graduate Center there. I guess UCLA had some connection to it as well. It certainly got federal funding, and it was in South Central LA. It was in Compton. And so Martin Luther King Hospital, the Charles S. Drew is a famous Black physician graduate center. And then the Fanon Center was located there. And it was after I co-authored the book on Frantz Fanon, Soweto and American Black Thought. And I think it was on a trip to Los Angeles. I'd lived in Los Angeles before. And I visited the center, and I was asked to give a talk there. Actually, it was a talk that came through the mediation of a friend of mine, Desmond Masilela, who was a South African activist who was a graduate student over at UCLA. And he got me to talk there at the Fanon Center, and that's where I met Dr. King, Louis King, at the time. And it was really a center of the modern iteration of Black psychology. Many famous Black psychologists that would become famous later on were there at that time. And it really was a research and intellectual center, as he describes in our interview. And it's one of these things where you wonder whatever happened to it. And so we went through a lot of trouble trying to reach him, trying to get his address, trying to get in touch with him. But once we did, it just kind of took off from there. He was very, very willing and excited to talk with us. And we did, I think we did 3 sessions, interviews with him. And he just saw it as an opportunity to, again, as one of the contributions of this book, to lay out the history of that center. I think there's more to be told, and I think maybe he's working on it. But this is a major center for mental health in the Black community. I know in your book with Roberto, you talk about the center in Harlem. What's the name of it? There was a mental health center in Harlem that Richard Wright had actually written a brochure for and whatnot back in the I guess it was back in the 30s or 40s. And so this was another part of that history of mental health in the Black community, from the Harlem Center from the 40s to the Fanon Center in Los Angeles in the 1980s. And so we're kind of wondering also with this book, where will the new mental health centers in the Black community come from, and will they be inspired by the work of Fanon, as we try to depict in our book? And so, as everyone knows, there's literally a dying need for new mental health resources in the Black community. It's part of, and I want to make this point and consider it political as anyone wants, the whole defund the police demand of the movement now is due to the fact of generations of defunding the Black community. And if you've done that for generations, certainly in the post-World War II period, of defunding and under-resourcing the Black community while you pour in resources for policing, then you get what you have today. So defunding the police is about casting a light on the disinvestment, the defunding of the Black community. I mean, so there's this proportion between the two, or disproportion between the two. And one of the great defunding of the Black community is the defunding for mental health services in the Black community. Chicago is horrible. I mean, it got rid of its mental health clinics in the Black community, let alone public health resources. I mean, that's why COVID-19 is so much ravaging the Black community. We talk about the disparities, but every now and then somebody points out is that, well, you've defunded public health in the Black community, let alone broader mental health and medical health resources in the Black community. So now, as people are beginning to say, we're suffering from these two pandemics within the Black community. But mental health has always been, and it's not very funded even in the ACA and Obamacare in terms of mental health resources. So there's a lot to be said about improving and increasing the resources for mental health in the Black community. I mean, it's just simple. I mean, you can't live in those kinds of colonial conditions. And now the internal colonialism piece is back. I mean, even liberals are talking about the Black community being a colony and whatnot. You can't live in those conditions and not have, the mental health outcomes, including racial violence. Chicago, Atlanta. I mean, we see the Black on Black homicides, every weekend. It's horrible. You can't have those outcomes and not look at what are the underlying conditions that produce them. And again, I think Fanone has something, has a lot to say about those kinds of things. And that's all racial capitalism, I can say.
Helen, do you want to add anything?
I realize where we are at in time, but I just have a couple of comments to talk about. Kind of interviewing Dr. King was a highlight for me because it was over we had 3 separate interviews with him. And so that was, it was incredible to learn more about the center. But one, it seemed as though the time in which the center arose in the 70s really came at a time that it was politically a good time. It was a time when people were thinking about this. They were more willing to take a radical lens in which looking at mental health. And now I think is the right political time to take up another Fanone Center. Dr. King talked about it as not just ending, but it was reincarnated into another center that was less radical in its intention, but still had the spirit of Fanone. So I think that we need to strike while the iron is hot, resurrect Fanone, and create another center that can kind of continue and extend the work of Fanone. The other thing that I think is important that we need to do, and that the Fanone Center did, was depathologize the Black community and mental health, much like Lou was talking about. So much of psychology is about pathologizing folks who are experiencing extreme poverty, racism, and are being alienated from the system in so many ways. So we need to depathologize that. The Fanone Center also had some really interesting ideas about pedagogy and teaching, which I think are important. And the other thing about the Fanone Center that King co-founded was this connection to Africa, to the continent. And they would actually take people to the continent and have these larger kind of conversations. And I think if we can look at the interconnections between our struggle, I think that would be particularly important, especially as people are wanting to grapple with the notions of anti-Blackness, and we could say anti-Blackness within global capitalism. And I think we could have a very fruitful conversation. So wanted to say those things.
And we just here quickly, we should mention Hussein Bullhans. We should mention again, he started the Frantz Fanon University. I mean, it's incredible in Somaliland, and that's a tremendous stage in the development of making Fanon global, but also bringing him into the various disciplines.
Well, thank you very much. I have lots more to ask you, but sadly we've run out of time, and I want to hand it back over to.
Nigel, you wanted to say something. I think you should be given some space to say it.
No. Go. No, I have more questions to ask. I think
don't we all?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, it's been a fascinating conversation, and an insight for me to understand the issues of Fanonian therapeutic practice, which I had very little knowledge of before, and look forward to reading your book. So thank you, Helen, Lou, for joining us. And Nigel, thank you for your help in moderating this discussion. I think you kept them well organized, and so thank you for that. And I hope we will have further conversations soon. And so thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you, Bruce.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
Okay. Go well. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you for a really interesting discussion about Fanonian revolutionary practice and Fanonian psychotherapeutic practices. What a lot of P's there. Thank you for joining us today on Organizing in the Time of COVID. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press signing off for now.